For 438 days, Jose Salvador Alvarenga lived inside a circle no bigger than a small fishing skiff, with the Pacific stretched around him like a sentence that wouldn't end. No harbor lights, no radio voice, no line on a map telling him where he was. Just sky, salt, birds, rain when it came, and long spells when it didn't. At first there were 2 men in that boat. Then there was one. By the time he reached the Marshall Islands, his beard hung down his chest, his ankles were swollen, and his mind had learned how to survive things his body never should have. The strangest part wasn't that the storm carried him away. It was everything the ocean demanded after that, and what it still couldn't take from him. He wasn't supposed to become a story people argued over in newspapers and hospitals and dockside bars. He was supposed to leave, work, come back, and sell fish. That was the shape of the trip. November 17th, 2012. The coast of southern Mexico. A routine fishing run from a world of engines, ice chests, bait, weather guesses, and men who knew the sea could be mean, but still went out because that was how money was made. Alvarenga was experienced, tough, and used to long hours offshore. His crewmate, Ezekiel, was younger, less seasoned, the kind of young man who still carried nerves at his shoulders. They boarded a small, open boat, about 24 feet long, the sort of vessel that feels practical near shore and painfully small once land disappears. They expected a couple of days. The ocean had something longer in mind. At the beginning, the work was ordinary. Vet ropes, diesel smell, fish scales shining on the deck, a horizon that seemed manageable because it always had been before. There was no reason yet to think the trip would split their lives into a before and after. The boat carried what it needed for a short run, not a migration across the Pacific. No one stocks an open fishing skiff for 14 months. No one leaves shore thinking, I should prepare to watch seasons change from the same plank floor. Men go to sea all the time, trusting the invisible agreement that weather turns, motors restart, radios answer, and coastlines return. That agreement held until the storm came at them hard enough to erase it. And once it broke all at once. The sky changed first. Any fisherman knows that uneasy shift when clouds stop being scenery and start becoming a problem. Wind stiffens. The water darkens. Distance looks different. Then the storm was on them, not far off, not maybe later, but there, slamming the boat with rain and rough water, turning the deck slick and the world loud. Waves rose high enough to block the view, then dropped them down into troughs where sky became a thin strip overhead. The motor failed. The radio died. GPS was gone. In one burst of weather, the things that tied them ashore had been knocked out, and the little skiff stopped being a workboat and became a drifting object. They bailed water, fought panic, and tried to keep the boat alive under them. But once a small vessel loses power in a storm that size, the ocean starts making the decisions. At first, survival looked temporary. You tell yourself they'll come looking. You tell yourself the storm will pass, and someone will catch sight of you. You tell yourself all you need to do is hold on until morning, or the next plane, or the next ship. That's how the mind protects itself in the early hours. Alvarenga and Ezekiel clung to that thin hope while the storm shoved them farther from the coast. Rain hit their faces like gravel. Salt water sloshed around their feet. The skiff rose, slammed, rose again. Every loose object became precious. Every container became potential water. Every minute without contact widened the silence. When daylight came and no rescue appeared, the truth started working its way in. They weren't waiting out bad weather anymore. They were already disappearing. The Pacific is cruel in a very specific way. It doesn't rush to finish you. It gives you room to measure what's happening. Once the storm moved on, the sea could look calm enough to lie to you. Blue water, wide sky, sunlight glittering on the surface like something harmless. But calm doesn't mean safe when you're in an open boat with no engine, no navigation, and no real way to force direction. The coast was gone. The 2 men were a drifting speck in a space so large that even fear had trouble finding its edges. Alvarenga began assessing what they had. An icebox for fish, buckets, a few tools, whatever food remained, containers that might catch rain. The stripped-down inventory of men who didn't know yet how valuable a plastic bottle could become. Somewhere in that open water, the first question appeared, and it would never fully leave. How long can a person live like this? Hunger wasn't the first enemy. Thirst was. At sea, water is everywhere and useless. Salt glitters and tempts and threatens. Drink it, and you lose faster. Alvarenga knew that. So every cloud mattered. Every drop mattered. Rain turned from weather into salvation. They angled containers upward, spread what they could, caught water any way they knew. They learned quickly how to drink carefully, how to resist the panic that comes when you don't know when the next storm will give you anything but trouble. The sun, meanwhile, became a second kind of predator. All day it leaned over the boat, burning their necks, their faces, the tops of their hands. They flipped the styrofoam fish box and used it as a makeshift shelter, crawling under it for strips of shade. Imagine two men folding themselves beneath an upside-down box on a drifting skiff, hiding from daylight like fugitives, and realizing this was only the beginning. Food came from whatever crossed their path. Fish first, then more than fish. Hunger edits the world. It teaches you to stop asking whether something is normal and start asking whether it keeps you alive. Alvarenga caught fish with his bare hands, with scraps, with speed, with repetition, learning the boat's edges and the habits of whatever life approached it. They ate raw because fire was fantasy most days. Turtle meat, birds, small sharks, jellyfish when desperation bent the menu that far. They drank turtle blood when they had it, because liquid was liquid and the body doesn't care what story you tell yourself while swallowing. The sea had become both prison and pantry, and they had to harvest from the thing trying to erase them. But not everyone adapts at the same rate, and the difference between Alvarenga and Ezekiel would soon grow into the most painful part of the voyage. Ezekiel had come aboard with less experience and, maybe more important, less callous in the mind. Some accounts say he was deeply religious, that someone in his church had warned him about death at sea. Whether that prophecy sat in his thoughts from the first wave, or only later, the effect was there all the same. He wasn't built for the raw improvisation Alvarenga could manage. The diet sickened him. The uncertainty hollowed him out. One day could be endured. 1 week could be argued with. But as their drift stretched on, Ezekiel began to shrink under the weight of it. Alvarenga tried to talk him up, keep him busy, keep him eating, keep the younger man tied to routine. Out there, routine was more than comfort. It was structure against collapse. But structure only works if both people agree to stand inside it, and Ezekiel was starting to slip away. There were moments when other ships appeared on the horizon, tiny and almost unreal, like toys set on the rim of the earth. Imagine seeing that after days or weeks with no human sign. Imagine the surge in your chest. They tried to signal. They waved. They burned cloth when they could. They shouted into distances too large for shouting. Once, one vessel seemed close enough to matter, a shape on the horizon that might have ended everything. But close at sea is often a lie. A ship can appear near and still be impossibly far, moving on another line entirely. The two men watched help fail to notice them and continue on. Hope, once raised, can hurt worse than hunger. It gives you something to fall from. The ocean taught them that too, and after each near miss, the silence around the boat felt heavier. Time started coming apart. Without shore, without clocks that mattered, without dates marked by anyone else, time becomes a private thing. Day-night cloud, clear moon, stars, rain. Alvarenga tracked what he could through the sky. Lunar cycles, the feel of repetition, the body's own rhythm of hunger and sleep. He walked the length of the boat as exercise back and forth, as if pacing a hallway in a house that no longer existed. That movement kept his muscles from turning to rope and his mind from freezing in place. He talked. He told stories. He built scenes aloud about food, about people on land, about tacos and fruit and ordinary afternoons. It sounds small, but imagination became equipment. If your body is stuck in an open boat, your mind has to learn how to leave without abandoning you. And that trick would keep him alive far longer than anyone watching from shore would have guessed. The stars became companions too. At sea, with no city glare, the night sky doesn't just hang above you. It pours down. It feels crowded, close, almost physical. The two men looked up and played games with the constellations, with shapes, with names, with guessing. It was something to do, yes, but also something else. The stars gave scale to their isolation. They reminded them that the world was bigger than the boat, bigger than the storm, bigger than panic. That can comfort you or crush you, depending on the hour. Some nights the sky must have felt like proof that they were still part of creation. Other nights, it probably looked like a ceiling no one would ever lower. Still, they kept looking up because if you stop looking up out there, you start looking only inward, and inward can become dangerous. As weeks blurred into months, the difference between surviving and giving up moved into the smallest acts. Catch the next fish. Save the next cup of rain. Crawl under the box when the sun turns the deck into a skillet. Stretch your legs. Check the horizon. Don't drink seawater. Don't waste energy thrashing at things you can't change. Alvarenga developed a system not because the system was elegant, but because no one survives 438 days through bursts of bravery alone. You survive by repeating stubborn, useful behavior until it feels like the only language left. He learned where birds would settle, how to grab them, how to keep them alive for later. He learned the smell of coming rain, the pattern of bad weather, the feel of his own body before it weakened too far. He was turning himself into something the open ocean hadn't expected to keep. Ezekiel couldn't make that turn. At some point, he became ill, badly ill. Some versions of the story say raw bird meat poisoned him after the bird had eaten something venomous. Maybe it was sickness from the diet in general. Maybe it was the entire situation settling into his system at once. Whatever the exact cause, his body began refusing the very thing survival required. He didn't want to eat. He didn't want to drink. Alvarenga tried to coax him with tiny pieces of food, feeding him like a brother, a parent, a medic, a friend. He even improvised little picks from fish bones to get morsels into him. That's one of the hardest images in the whole story. A man adrift on the open Pacific, trying to save his dying companion with slivers of raw food balanced on the bones of other fish, because that's all the world has left to offer. Conversation changed after that. Early on, they had shared fear. Then they shared routine. Now Alvarenga carried most of the talking by himself. He invented stories about the shore, about girls they might see, meals they would eat, places they would walk. It wasn't childish. It was medicine. He was trying to keep Ezekiel tied to life by tying him to scenes beyond the boat. But imagination has limits when a body starts shutting down. Ezekiel pulled away, not in anger, but with the thin distance of someone already drifting elsewhere. His face changed. His voice faded. He watched the water more. He lay still more. A little boat at sea can hold two people and still become unbearably lonely if one of them has already begun to leave, and Alvarenga had to feel that leaving long before death actually arrived. When it came in a space no bigger than a room. There were no doctors, no blankets, no machines, no last-minute rescue. Just sea, sky, wood, salt, and one exhausted man watching another fade. Ezekiel died after weeks of decline, and for Alvarenga, that moment did more than break companionship. It changed the logic of the entire ordeal. Up to then, survival had still been shared. There had been witness, responsibility, another heartbeat in the boat. Suddenly, there wasn't. The only other face in his world had gone still. The only voice besides his own had been cut off. The Pacific got larger in that instant, not because the water changed, but because loneliness did. He was no longer a fisherman with a crewmate. He was now the only living man in a drifting skiff somewhere in the largest ocean on Earth, and the boat still had months to ask of him. He kept the body with him for days. That detail alone tells you how distorted reality had become. He talked to Ezekiel. He argued with him. He couldn't let go immediately because letting the body go meant accepting a new level of aloneness he wasn't ready to face. In a normal world, death is followed by people, by ritual, by movement, by some arrangement of grief. Out there, grief had nowhere to go. It sat in the boat. It slept beside him. It occupied the same small space where survival had to continue. Eventually, the condition of the body forced the decision. Alvarenga pushed his companion into the sea, and even that act didn't end the company completely. For a long time after, he still spoke to him in his mind. Out there, memory becomes a person you can almost hear answering back. After Ezekiel died, the ocean changed again. Physically, it was the same world. Glare off the water, birds circling, storms rolling through, the boat rocking and slamming and drifting wherever currents wanted. But inside Alvarenga, the rules were different. There was no longer anyone to impress, reassure, or protect. Survival became an argument between him and the elements alone. That can sharpen a person or undo him. In his case, it did both, sometimes in the same day. He later said there were moments he wanted to die. Of course there were. A person can only stare at emptiness for so long before emptiness starts suggesting things. The shock isn't that he considered ending it. The shock is that he kept finding reasons not to. Sometimes those reasons were faith, sometimes memory, sometimes sheer spite against the sea. He drank urine during stretches when there was nothing else. People hear that and treat it like the centerpiece, but in truth it's only one note in a much larger symphony of desperation. More telling is the phrase that fits so many of those days. When there was nothing, I would eat nothing. Try to imagine the flat acceptance in that. Not drama, not panic, just long, empty hours where the body asks for fuel and the world says no. He learned to endure the ache, the cramp, the weakness. Then, when life appeared near the boat, he became quick again, hands snapping toward fish, arms reaching for birds, knives working, containers ready for blood or rain or anything wet enough to matter. The cycle repeated until survival itself became a craft, as precise and exhausting as any job he'd ever worked, and one mistake could still undo all of it. Storms never really stopped being terrifying. Rain could save him, but heavy weather also threatened to capsize the boat, wash away what little he'd gathered, or leave him injured with no one to help. He rode waves that lifted the skiff high enough to show him wide fields of water before dropping him into valleys of foam. In daylight, the ocean flashed like broken glass. At night, it became pure movement and sound. Wind would hammer the side of the hull. Spray would slap his face. The boat would creak and shudder, as if deciding whether to stay together. Sometimes the same storm that nearly killed him would later refill his containers and let him drink. That's how survival often works. What saves you doesn't come clean. Mercy and danger can arrive wearing the same face, and Alvarenga had no choice but to accept both. There were stretches of floating debris too, little signatures of a human world moving just beyond reach. A bottle, a crate, once in a while food scraps that had no business being in the middle of the Pacific. Cabbage, carrots, maybe a container with enough residue to lick clean. These weren't meals so much as reminders that somewhere ships still crossed established routes. People still ate at tables. Cargo still moved from one country to another while he drifted outside the schedule of ordinary life. To him, those scraps must have felt almost insulting in their normalcy. Here is a piece of the world you belong to, the sea seemed to say, but not the world itself. Take this peel, this bottle, this float, and keep drifting. He took what he could anyway, because dignity had no nutritional value. What keeps a man sane through a year alone on the Pacific? Not strength in the movie sense, not a fixed smile or speeches to the horizon. Sanity, in that boat, looked more like maintenance. Talking out loud, remembering faces, inventing scenes on shore, replaying old conversations, imagining what people were eating, what music might be playing somewhere, what a market sounded like, what a street smelled like after rain. He built invisible company. He turned memory into shelter the way the styrofoam box became shade. If he had let silence fully settle in, it might have hardened around him. So he broke it again and again with words, songs, muttered plans, prayers, even arguments. People underestimate how much of survival is social even when you're alone. We aren't designed for long isolation. He had to keep a version of humanity alive inside his head long enough for his body to make land. His body changed in ways impossible to ignore. Skin burned, then toughened. Hair grew wild. Beard thickened. Joints swelled. Muscles shifted from a worker's strength to a survivor's economy. He wasn't skeletal in the way people expected because the sea, for all its indifference, had continued to feed him just enough. That detail would later make some doubt him. But bodies don't follow cinematic scripts. A man living on fish, birds, turtles, and rainwater can look less like a ghost than people imagine. Even so, he carried the wear of months under the sun. Salt cracked his skin. Sleep came in broken fragments. He had to move to keep from stiffening. He had to protect his eyes, his feet, his hands, the tools he was left with. The body becomes your entire toolbox in a survival situation, and every cut, every sore, every weakness threatens the whole project. There must have been anniversaries out there he didn't fully know he was passing. Holidays, birthdays, seasons on land marked by decorations and family meals, and weather changing over roofs and roads. Meanwhile, he was drifting under the same sky, though it never looked the same twice. Moon phases became his calendar. Bird migrations hinted at geography he couldn't name. Currents carried him west across enormous distances, from the coast of the Americas toward islands he'd never planned to see. The sea was moving him through the world while keeping the world hidden. That's one of the strangest truths of his story. He traveled farther than many people do in a lifetime, but from the inside of that journey, it probably felt like motionless repetition. Same boat, same waves, same need, same question every morning. Can I get through this day too? At some point, survival and identity blurred together. He was no longer just Jose, a fisherman from El Salvador working out of Mexico. He was the man in the boat, the man who catches birds by hand, the man who waits for rain, the man who talks to the dead and measures time by moons. That narrowing can be dangerous because it makes the old life feel dreamlike, but it can also help. If all you are is the next task, then the next task is enough. Catch this fish. Save this water. Ride out this squall. Rest while the sun is highest. Look for land even when there is none. Endure. Endure again. People from outside ask, how did he survive 438 days? A better question might be, how many times did he survive one day, then another, and another, until the number became too large to imagine? Then came the final approach, though he didn't know it was final at first. Land after so long can look like another trick. A change in bird patterns, debris that seems different, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind, a line on the horizon that holds steady instead of dissolving into weather. After more than 14 months, after enough false hopes to train suspicion into his bones, he had every reason to doubt what he saw. But the line stayed. The green became real. January 30th, 2014. Tile Islet, part of Eben Atoll in the Marshall Islands. A tiny piece of land in a vast ocean, and to one man in a beaten skiff, it might as well have been another planet. Imagine the shock of approaching shore after so long that shore has become almost mythical. He didn't stride on a land like a hero in a film. He arrived battered, swollen, sun-marked, weak, wrapped in the physical evidence of everything he'd endured. His boat had washed up on a reef. He made it ashore and found people who could hardly understand what had emerged in front of them. Ragged underwear, long hair, heavy beard, skin browned and worn by months of sea and sun. A human being carrying the look of a castaway, so complete it felt torn from an older century. And then there was the story. 14 months adrift. One dead companion. Raw fish. Birds. Rainwater. Adrift across the Pacific, so huge it sounded invented. He'd reached people at last, but now the challenge was different. How do you tell a story that even you would have doubted before it happened to you? At first, even officials and rescuers struggled to process him. He wasn't the kind of skeleton they'd expected from a tale like that. He could smile. He could speak. He wanted things that sounded oddly normal after such an ordeal. A haircut, familiar food, a phone. His mind was scrambled from shock and deprivation, but one instinct was clear: go home. He started naming relatives, places, fragments of identity scattered across El Salvador, Mexico, in the United States. The names checked out. The past he carried inside him began reattaching to the present. Somewhere far away, people who had laid flowers for a missing fisherman learned he was alive. Think about that moment from shore. A man mourned as dead, suddenly reappearing from the middle of the Pacific, carrying a beard, a scarred body, and a story longer than disbelief. The world did what it always does with stories this extreme. It questioned, measured, doubted, investigated. Some wondered how anyone could survive that long. Others pointed to his knowledge of fishing, his physical condition, the current patterns, the pieces that fit. But for Alvarenga, the argument in headlines was smaller than what he'd already lived through. He knew what the sun felt like on day 100, day 300. He knew what it meant to hold a dying companion. He knew the taste of rain caught after desperate thirst. He knew the silence after a ship failed to see him. He knew the weird intimacy of talking to stars because no one else was there. Whether the world believed fast or slowly, the ocean had already signed its name on him. He didn't need proof in the way spectators did. What lingers most in his story isn't just endurance. It's the shape endurance took, not polished bravery, not constant confidence. He survived through uglier, more human means: fear, hunger, improvisation, routine, grief, denial, talking out loud, bargaining with himself, refusing finality one more morning. He cared for Ezekiel until he couldn't. He kept moving when motion was absurd. He kept inventing life on shore, so his mind wouldn't lock itself inside the boat forever. The sea stripped him down to appetite, weather, memory, and will, and somehow that stripped-down man remained enough. That should unsettle us a little, because it means survival doesn't always come from the strongest version of ourselves. Sometimes it comes from the most stubborn, the most adaptable, the one willing to keep going in a form barely recognizable as ordinary life. And maybe that's why this story stays with people. The Pacific in this case isn't just water. It's time, loneliness, repetition, and the terrifying possibility that no one is coming soon. Jose Salvador Alvarenga floated across all of that. He watched one man die. He watched weather become food and threat at once. He watched his own mind invent pathways back to humanity while his body drifted farther from it. Then, after 438 days, the ocean that had refused to give him a road finally gave him an island. Not a triumphant ending with fanfare, just sand underfoot, green trees, startled faces, and the first real break in the silence. By then he had already crossed the hardest distance, the one between giving up and not giving up, and that's the part of the voyage that still feels almost impossible.